Imagine this, a couple, filled with hope, stepping into the home of their dreams. They've searched, saved, and finally found the perfect place to start a new chapter in their lives. It seems like everything is falling into place. But then, something unexpected happens. The door they thought was open is suddenly slammed shut. A denial. The reason? A heartbreaking one that many have faced but few talk about. This story isn't just about a couple being turned away from a home. It's about the deep, painful realities that many people experience in silence. It's about discrimination that still exists, even in the most modern, progressive places. They were told no. But what happened next is something no one could have predicted. It's a series of twists that will make you question everything you thought you knew about fairness, justice, and hope. For weeks, they had filled out paperwork, met with agents, and even pictured their life in that home living room conversations, family meals, the feeling of truly belonging somewhere. They had envisioned their children growing up in the backyard, a space to call their own. But when it came time to sign the papers, they were told that despite meeting all the requirements, their application was denied. At first, it didn't make sense. Was it a mistake? Or was something more sinister at play? The first shock is hard to swallow. But the real story begins when they decide not to give up. The decision to fight, to stand up for their rights, and challenge the system that tried to hold them down sets off a chain of events that neither of them could have foreseen. What would you do if you were faced with a denial that didn't feel right? Would you walk away or push forward? The road ahead is filled with challenges they didn't expect. From navigating the complex world of housing laws to facing a system that sometimes seems built to exclude them, every step feels like a battle. But this couple isn't backing down. They're about to take a stand that will not only change their lives but could impact others who face same harsh reality. And just when it seems like they've reached an impasse, something unexpected happens. An ally steps forward, someone who has seen this injustice before. But can this person really help them? Can they break down the walls of discrimination and bring about the change that's so desperately needed? Stay with us as we dive deeper into the story of resilience, courage, and the pursuit of justice. This is a journey you won't want to miss, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fairness in today's world. What happens next? Well, let's just say, you won't believe the shocking turn of events that follow. They were no strangers to hard work. In fact, the couple had poured their hearts into everything they did. The hours spent balancing jobs, saving every penny, making sacrifices, all for this one goal, a home they could call their own. And when they found it, this perfect little house, it felt like a reward for everything they had endured. It wasn't just about the house, it was about what it symbolized. Stability. Security. A place where they could build memories, grow their family, and perhaps even one day pass down to their children. The moment they walked through the front door for the first time was magical. They could already picture the living room decorated with their favorite things, the kitchen where they would cook together, the garden where they could finally have a space to breathe. Every room had a story waiting to be written. They submitted all the necessary documents with careful attention to detail: bank statements, credit scores, employment records. They knew they were ready, that they had the means to afford the house. Their offer had been accepted quickly, and they thought they were well on their way to a new life. But as the days passed, that excitement began to turn into something else: anxiety. When they got the call to finalize everything, they were nervous but hopeful. The last piece of the puzzle? The agent on the other side of the phone was cheerful at first, going through the final steps, asking them to come in for a meeting to sign the papers. But then, in a shift that caught them completely off guard, the tone changed. "I'm afraid your application has been denied." It took a moment for the words to sink in. Denied? They weren't sure if they had heard her correctly. The agent repeated herself, explaining that despite meeting all the requirements, something had come up. It wasn't the paperwork, it wasn't the finances, everything seemed to be in order. But for some reason, they weren't going to be able to get the home. Confusion turned to disbelief. They were stunned. This wasn't just any house. This was the house. Their dream. The one that had felt like it was meant for them. Why? Why would this happen? They tried to get answers. They asked the agent for specifics, for anything that might explain the decision. But the agent's responses were vague, too vague for comfort. There was no clear reason. Just that the application was denied. They were left in the dark, trying to piece together what had happened. At first, they thought it might have been a simple mistake. Maybe an issue with the paperwork. Perhaps there had been a glitch or some kind of administrative error? But after making several calls, each one more frustrating than the last, it became clear that something far more complex was at play. This wasn't an accident. Something had happened that had nothing to do with their application or their ability to pay. But what? They decided to investigate. They weren't going to let this go. They had worked too hard, invested too much, to just walk away from this. The journey of finding their home had been long enough, and they weren't about to let it end here, with no answers. They started by reaching out to other agents, trying to find someone who could give them some insight. But most of them turned them away, unwilling to discuss the issue. The silence was deafening. Then, they made a bold decision: they would visit the office in person. They needed to see someone face to face, speak to a manager, and demand a clear explanation. It wasn't easy. The office was intimidating. The waiting area was filled with high-end brochures and luxurious decor, a stark contrast to the unease that had taken over their minds. They sat there, waiting for someone to acknowledge them, but no one seemed to be in a rush to help. They waited for what felt like hours before a manager finally came out to speak with them. The conversation was uncomfortable, full of evasion and unclear answers. The manager, though polite, didn't seem to want to offer any real explanation. "It's just a decision from the underwriting department," they said, offering nothing more. There were no specifics, no clarity about why the couple's application had been singled out. They left that office feeling more confused than ever. They didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was becoming clear: they were being treated differently. There was something else at play here, something bigger than just a denied application. Determined to get to the bottom of this, they decided to dig deeper into the history of the property, the neighborhood, and the agency itself. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon some unsettling truths. They discovered that there had been other instances where applications had been denied, and in every case, the people involved seemed to share something in common. The suspicion began to grow: was it possible that the rejection wasn't just about their credit score or financial history? Could it have been about something else? Something less visible but just as real? The couple began talking to others in the community, reaching out to neighbors and local activists who were familiar with the area. That's when they started hearing whispers of discrimination. It wasn't something they had expected to encounter, but the stories were starting to pile up. Other families, who had applied for homes in the same neighborhood, had experienced similar rejections, for reasons that didn't add up. Each story sounded like their own: good credit, stable jobs, everything in place yet still denied. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Could this really be happening? Could they be the victims of something so insidious, something that had been quietly taking place right under their noses? As the weeks went on, the couple began piecing together a growing picture of injustice. What they were uncovering was more than just a few isolated incidents. This was part of a larger pattern, a system that seemed to be stacked against them. But who was behind it? What forces were at work? And most importantly, could they take a stand against it? They realized they needed more than just answers, they needed allies. They couldn't take on this battle alone. The stakes were too high. They reached out to organizations that specialized in housing discrimination, hoping they might have the resources, knowledge, and support they needed to fight back. It wasn't long before they connected with someone who had been fighting these types of battles for years. The ally, an expert in civil rights law, listened to their story and immediately began making calls on their behalf. But even with this new support, they still didn't have answers. The fight was just beginning. The more they learned, the more questions they had. And the more they learned about the practices behind their rejection, the more they realized that the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. The system was rigged. But they were no longer willing to accept the status quo. Their lives had already been upended by the denial of their home, but what they didn't know yet was that this experience would spark a much larger movement. It would lead to more than just one fight for one home. It would challenge the very systems that allowed this kind of discrimination to thrive. As they prepared to take the next step in their journey, they found themselves standing at a crossroads. There were risks involved, many unknowns, and the path ahead was far from clear. But one thing was certain, they weren't backing down. The question now wasn't just whether they would be able to buy a home. It was whether they could tear down the walls of injustice and make sure that no one else would ever have to face the same fight. And just as they started to prepare for the next step, something unexpected happened. A phone call came through. It was a tip, an anonymous source who claimed to know something that could change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, but the words that followed were anything but. "You have no idea what you're up against. But you're on the right track. There's more to this than you can imagine." Their hearts raced. What did this person know? What were they about to uncover? The tension was unbearable. Would they be able to continue their fight, or was something far more dangerous lurking in the shadows? They would have to find out. The couple sat in silence after the call, the weight of the words hanging in the air. It was as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and the very foundation of their fight had taken on a new, unsettling complexity. Who was this mysterious tipster, and what did they know about the system they were up against? The fear began to creep in, mingling with the growing sense of urgency. They had come so far, yet there was so much more to uncover. The first question they faced was whether they could trust this anonymous source. It could have been anyone, someone with an agenda, or perhaps even someone trying to throw them off track. But they couldn't ignore the possibility that this tip might be their breakthrough. They needed to dig deeper. And they needed to do it quickly. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. The rejection of their application had already caused so many ripples in their lives. It was impossible to go back to where they were before. They couldn't let the system silence them. Not now. But there was more to this fight than they initially realized. As they began following up on the tip, they uncovered strange inconsistencies in the housing market. The more they spoke to people, the more they began to see a disturbing trend. The rejections weren't isolated. They had been happening for years. Families, individuals all with good credit, stable jobs, and a solid track record denied homes in neighborhoods where they were clearly qualified. And it wasn't just in one area. This was happening across multiple regions, across different cities. It felt like an invisible hand was pushing certain people out, even when they had every right to be there. One of the sources they reached out to had worked in real estate for decades, and when the couple shared their story, the response was immediate and chilling. "You're not the first," the source said. "This isn't just a glitch or a mistake. It's a pattern. It's systemic." The agent explained that certain neighborhoods had become more and more difficult to access for certain groups of people. Some areas were openly referred to as no-go zones for people of color, while others remained locked behind high walls of gatekeeping and exclusion, often disguised as minor technicalities in the process. The source even hinted at something darker: a network of players, both within the industry and outside of it, whose interests were tied to keeping certain areas homogeneous. The tipster's voice dropped lower, like they were afraid of being overheard, as they warned, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. If you keep digging, it could get dangerous." At that moment, the couple realized just how deep this went. It wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that had the power to shape the lives of countless others. They couldn't let it go. The fight for their home had grown into a battle for fairness, for the right to exist in spaces where they had been told they didn't belong. But the danger was real. The more they uncovered, the more they felt the weight of this looming threat. Someone was watching. Someone was making sure they didn't get too close to the truth. They could feel it in the strange calls they received, disconnected numbers, cryptic messages. And there was always someone lurking in the background, just out of sight. Still, the couple pressed on. They spoke to others who had faced similar struggles, hearing heartbreaking stories of families torn apart by discrimination. They connected with local activists who had been fighting for fair housing rights for years. Together, they began to piece together a clearer picture, a story of exclusion and deceit. But it wasn't just the housing market they had to contend with. The fight for a home was intertwined with a much larger issue, an issue that reached into the very heart of their community and beyond. One afternoon, while meeting with a group of housing advocates, they were approached by a local journalist who had been investigating these practices for years. The journalist, too, had seen the connections, the threads that were slowly revealing a larger web of corruption and discrimination. As the conversation grew more intense, the journalists revealed that they had a source within the real estate industry, someone with direct access to the high-level meetings where deals were made, where policies were created to keep certain people out of these homes. But even with all this new information, the couple was left with a growing sense of helplessness. They could see the pieces of the puzzle, but they couldn't yet see the whole picture. The system was vast, and it felt like they were trying to fight an invisible force. They felt like they were being watched every step of the way. As they navigated this dangerous terrain, they couldn't help but wonder, who else was complicit in this? Who had something to gain by keeping these communities segregated? And most terrifying of all, who would be willing to stop them from finding the truth? As their investigation deepened, the couple started experiencing a series of increasingly unsettling events. Their phones started acting strangely, calls would drop unexpectedly, and strange, untraceable numbers would show up on their caller ID. Their emails were hacked. Documents mysteriously vanished. It became clear that someone was trying to derail their efforts, to make them give up. But they refused. They couldn't let the fear stop them now, not after everything they had uncovered. At the same time, they had to deal with the toll this was taking on their personal lives. The stress of it all was wearing them down. The emotional roller coaster of fighting a system that seemed rigged against them, while dealing with the daily challenges of everyday life, began to strain their relationship. They had to remind themselves why they started this journey. It wasn't just about a house. It was about justice. It was about proving that they had the right to live in the spaces they dreamed of, spaces that were meant to belong to everyone, not just the privileged few. But the couple wasn't the only ones feeling the heat. Their fight began to attract attention, both good and bad. Local news outlets picked up their story, drawing more attention to the issue, which led to an influx of people contacting them, sharing their own experiences of being denied homes. There was a movement slowly gaining momentum, but not everyone was thrilled with this sudden attention. In the shadows, there were powerful forces at work, and the couple soon realized just how much power was behind the scenes, pulling the strings. At one point, they even received a chilling warning from an anonymous number, one that simply said, "Stop. Or else." Despite everything, they refused to back down. But the tension was palpable. Every corner they turned, it felt like there were more questions than answers. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, hoping that the next step would bring them closer to the truth. And then, as they prepared to meet with the journalist again, something shocking happened. The person who had been helping them, the one who had been feeding them critical information from within the system, suddenly disappeared without a trace. Their phone went dead, their apartment was cleared out, and no one knew where they had gone. It was as though they had vanished from the face of the earth. Was this a coincidence? Or was it part of a larger, more dangerous plan to silence them? The couple was left alone in the storm, with no clear path ahead. What had started as a fight for a home had become a fight for their lives. And they were beginning to realize that, in this battle, there would be no easy answers. Just more questions. More danger. And more uncertainty. But as they stood at the edge of it all, they knew one thing for certain: they had come too far to turn back now. The fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The couple's world was beginning to unravel in ways they hadn't anticipated. The disappearance of their key source, the journalist they had been relying on, was a turning point. It wasn't just the fact that someone had vanished, it was the eerie feeling that they were now completely exposed. The silence that followed felt like an ominous presence, hanging over them, pressing in from all sides. They were more alone than ever, with no clear ally in sight. The thought of walking away crossed their minds only for a moment, but quickly they both knew this was bigger than them. It was about something far more important than a house or a personal battle. It was about standing up against a system that had been allowed to operate in the shadows for far too long. They spent the next few days carefully retracing every step they had taken, every person they had met, trying to figure out where they had gone wrong. The deeper they dug, the darker it became. It wasn't just real estate agents or corrupt landlords they were up against: a network, a machine that had been operating unchecked for years, if not decades. People who had power, influence, and resources they could never have imagined. It was as though this was a fight they had never truly been prepared for. But that didn't matter now. They had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The more they discovered, the more it became clear they weren't just up against a group of rogue real estate agents. They were challenging an entire system that was deeply entrenched in every level of society. Discrimination was no longer something they could ignore, it was embedded in the very structure of the housing market. The anonymous tip they had received, the one that had set them on this path, had only been the first glimpse of a much larger, darker truth. The more they learned, the more they realized that people like them, people who looked like them, had been systematically pushed out of neighborhoods for years, locked out of opportunities because of an unwritten code that was meant to keep them at the margins. It wasn't just about denying one family a home. It was about maintaining a legacy of control and exclusion. The couple knew they had to expose this for what it was. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their journey became. Strange things began happening. They'd find their phones tampered with, their emails intercepted, their home bugged. It wasn't subtle anymore. They were being watched, hunted even. Someone, or something, was making sure they wouldn't get too close to the core of the conspiracy. And yet they kept going. Each new threat, each new attempt to intimidate them, only fueled their determination to see it through. They tried to meet with the journalists' contacts, hoping to continue where they had left off, but those attempts were met with dead ends. People who had once been willing to help suddenly clammed up, their doors closed, their numbers disconnected. It was as though the whole city had gone into lockdown. Every lead they followed felt colder than the last. And just when they thought they might be getting closer, they found themselves in deeper water. At one point, they managed to track down a few more individuals who had worked within the real estate network. But when they met, their conversation was cut short. One of the individuals suddenly received a warning, a message on their phone, something cryptic that had them visibly shaken. That was when they realized just how far-reaching the people behind this system were. These were not just local players. This was a network with influence that extended far beyond what they had initially thought. As the walls seemed to close in around them, the couple found themselves on the verge of a breaking point. Each piece of evidence they uncovered seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. They were no longer sure who to trust, who had their back, or who was feeding them false information to throw them off course. The anxiety was palpable, the tension unbearable. The threats, the warnings, the subtle manipulations, it all felt like a web they couldn't escape from. They had gone from simply wanting to expose an injustice to being caught in a race against time to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy before it was too late. Then, as if to add fuel to the fire, something happened that completely rocked them to their core. One evening, after a meeting with a potential ally who had promised new leads, they returned home to find everything had been ransacked. Their computers, their files, everything they had gathered up until that point was gone. It was clear that whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to keep them from revealing the truth. It felt like a blow they hadn't seen coming, a harsh reminder that they were no longer just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their safety, their future, and everything they held dear. The sense of loss, of helplessness, was overwhelming. But they weren't ready to give up. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. The deeper they dug, the more they realized they were right on the edge of something much larger than they could have ever imagined. The real estate industry was just the tip of the iceberg. This was a network of corruption, a system of power that reached across every sector. People in power had been carefully managing who got to live where, who got access to resources, who was allowed to move up the social ladder. And it wasn't just about homes anymore, it was about control, power, and a system that kept people in their place. With everything they had worked for slipping through their fingers, the couple knew they had only one choice. They had to take everything they had learned and go public. They had to make this story impossible to ignore. They began reaching out to news outlets, to activist groups, to anyone who might help them shine a light on this dark truth. But even that was a dangerous game. As soon as they started to gather momentum, more obstacles appeared. Their every move seemed to be tracked, their every conversation overheard. It was clear that the people behind this wouldn't just allow them to reveal what they had learned. They would do anything to stop it. As they sat in their apartment, piecing together their final move, they knew that the climax of this story was approaching. Every step had led them here, to this moment of uncertainty, to this point where they could either make their stand or watch everything they had worked for crumble. The tension was unbearable. Each second felt like it could be their last opportunity to turn the tide. They had come too far to back down now, but would they be able to survive the final confrontation? Would they be able to expose the truth before it was too late? The question lingered, unanswered, as they prepared to take the next step, whatever it might be. The tension was at its breaking point. And no one knew what would happen next. Just when they thought they had a grasp on what was happening, the couple's world was rocked again. The morning after their final meeting, as they were reviewing their notes and preparing their next move, an unexpected call came through. It was a private number. They almost didn't answer, thinking it could be another threat, another attempt to throw them off course. But something urged them to pick up, and what they heard next was a shock that rattled them to their core. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as it told them, "You're not the only ones looking for answers." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the couple exchanged uneasy glances. "Who is this?" they asked, trying to keep their composure. The voice simply replied, "Let's just say I've been watching your every move. You're not the first to dig into this, and you won't be the last. But there's something you need to know." The line went dead before they could respond. In that moment, the couple realized they were no longer in control of the narrative. The investigation had escalated far beyond what they could have imagined. There was someone else involved now, someone who had been watching them, tracking their every step. It wasn't just the corrupt system they were up against anymore, it was a hidden hand, pulling strings from behind the scenes. And the revelation sent a chill through them. They had unwittingly stumbled into something even darker than they'd realized. In the days that followed, everything they thought they knew began to crumble. Their trusted sources began to act differently. The people who had been feeding them information now seemed distant, reluctant to speak. The atmosphere in the city had changed too. It was as though the entire world had suddenly grown colder, more hostile. Doors that had once been open now slammed shut, and the people they had hoped to rely on turned away. The phone calls grew more frequent, each one offering cryptic warnings that only deepened the mystery. The couple was being pushed into a corner, and they were beginning to understand the depth of the forces that were working against them. Then came the second plot twist, the moment that changed everything. A package arrived at their doorstep. It was small, nondescript, and came with no return address. Inside, they found a series of photographs, some of them from their personal life, some from their investigation. They could see their car, parked outside a restaurant. They could see them walking to a meeting, the camera capturing them from a distance. But there was more. Among the photographs was a single piece of paper with a simple message: "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." At first, they thought it was just another empty threat, part of the intimidation they'd been facing. But something about the package felt different. It was too close, too specific. Whoever had sent it was watching them, and not from a distance. They were closer than they realized, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Every step they took was being monitored, every move they made was being tracked. They had become pawns in a much larger game. The realization hit hard: the forces against them were not just powerful, they were omnipresent. This new turn of events sent the couple spiraling. They knew they had to push forward, but now the fear of what might come next loomed larger than ever. They couldn't trust anyone, not even their closest allies. How could they when they had no idea who was really on their side? Who could they trust when the lines between friend and foe had become so blurred? The tension continued to mount. The days grew darker, and with each passing hour, the couple found themselves slipping deeper into the shadows. They tried to reach out for help, but every attempt to contact their original sources was met with silence. Even the journalists' leads had disappeared, erased like a ghost from their past. Were they being set up? Were they just pieces in someone else's twisted game? Then, on a night filled with rain and uncertainty, the real magnitude of the situation became clear. They were sitting in their apartment, surrounded by the remnants of their research, when they heard a knock at the door. The sound was soft at first, barely a whisper against the heavy rain, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through them. They froze. Who could it be at this hour? Could it be the people who had been following them, preparing for their next move? The knock came again, more insistent this time. Cautiously, they approached the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one standing outside. Just a small envelope wedged between the door and the frame. Hesitantly, they opened it and found another message, handwritten in stark, cold letters: "We know everything. You've gone too far this time." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And with it, the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. They were no longer just fighting to expose an injustice. They were fighting for their lives. The mystery deepened, and the couple realized they had reached a breaking point. No matter how much they had uncovered, it was becoming increasingly clear that there were forces at play far beyond their comprehension. The people they were up against weren't just playing for control, they were playing for keeps. They could feel the walls closing in. Every lead they followed seemed to lead to another dead end, another deadlock. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, and with it came the gut-wrenching realization: the truth they had been fighting for was slipping away. The stakes had never been higher. The danger had never been greater. But one thing became clear as the couple looked at the storm brewing outside their window: they were not backing down. Not now, not ever. They had come too far, uncovered too much. The truth, no matter how dangerous, had to come to light. They would risk everything to see it exposed, no matter who or what they had to face. And with that resolve, they began to make plans for their next move. The intensity was escalating. They had no idea what would happen next or who would be left standing in the end. But one thing was certain, they were in this fight for the long haul. The night they had feared finally arrived. A storm had begun to rage outside, the winds howling and the rain pounding against their windows. Inside, the couple sat quietly, huddled together, ready to face whatever was coming next. The message from the envelope had shaken them to the core, but they had no choice now. There was no turning back. Their only option was to confront the forces at play head-on, even if they had no idea who those forces truly were. As they discussed their plan, a knock echoed through the apartment. This time, it was not a faint tap, but an urgent, demanding strike. The sound seemed to vibrate through their bones, and for a brief moment, they both froze. Could this be at the moment they had been dreading? They glanced at each other, their hearts racing. Slowly, they stood up, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. They opened the door, expecting the worst, only to find something they didn't expect, a small, plain manila envelope lying on the floor. No one was there. Just as they bent down to pick it up, the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. It was too quiet, too still. The world outside seemed to stop. Trembling, they opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At first, the message seemed simple, almost like one of the others, but as they read it, the true gravity of the situation began to sink in. It was a list of names. Names of people they knew, people they trusted, people they had spoken to in the past weeks. All of them were linked to the housing crisis, the corruption, the cover-ups. But at the bottom of the page, there was one more name, themselves. The message was chilling, you were never meant to find this. Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about exposing an injustice. They hadn't simply uncovered a corrupt system. No, this went deeper. Far deeper. They had unknowingly stepped into a much larger conspiracy, a conspiracy that involved people they knew, people they had trusted. And now, the truth was catching up with them. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were fighting for their survival. The phone rang again, this time with a number they didn't recognize. Their hands shook as they answered it. "You've gone too far," the voice on the other end said, eerily calm. "The game is over. There's no place for you now. You should have stopped digging." Before they could respond, the line went dead. A wave of realization hit them, they were trapped. The people behind this had already anticipated their every move, and they were too far in now to back out. But in that moment, something changed. The couple was no longer afraid. They knew they had come this far for a reason, to bring this all to light, no matter the cost. But then, as they prepared for their next steps, the final twist came. They received an email, an anonymous one, with no subject and no signature. The message inside was simple: "You're looking in the wrong place." It was a cryptic message, but one that seemed to shift everything. They realized that their investigation had been focused on the wrong people, the wrong institutions. The truth wasn't where they had been searching, it was right in front of them all along, hidden in plain sight. And that's when the shocking truth was revealed. The people pulling the strings behind the corruption, the ones controlling everything, weren't just corrupt businesspeople or powerful politicians. No, the real puppet masters were much closer than that. The system that had trapped them, the forces that had been monitoring them, were connected to a web of influence that spanned far beyond what they had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of injustice, it was a global network, one that had been pulling the strings for years. In an instant, the couple understood the magnitude of what they had uncovered. This was bigger than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about a housing crisis, or even racial injustice. No, this was a system that controlled everything. From media to real estate, from politics to law enforcement, it was all connected. And they had unwittingly become part of a much larger story, one that no one had ever expected them to uncover. The realization hit them hard. They had been playing their part in a game they didn't fully understand. But now they were no longer willing to be pawns. They had uncovered the truth, and they knew they had a responsibility to share it. But with that knowledge came an unbearable weight. They couldn't just expose the conspiracy, they had to do it without getting caught. Without becoming part of the system's next target. As they sat in the dim light of their apartment, the storm still raging outside, they knew the fight wasn't over. They had uncovered the truth, but now the real battle began. Would they survive long enough to bring it to light? Would the world listen to their story? Or would they, too, become another name on a list, another casualty in a fight that no one knew had been happening? They didn't have answers yet. But one thing was certain, they weren't going down without a fight. And with that, the storm inside their hearts seemed to match the one outside, fierce, unrelenting, and ready to change the world. The couple stood at the threshold, ready to face whatever was next. What they had learned, what they had uncovered, it had set in motion something far larger than themselves. It wasn't just about a home anymore, it was about exposing a system, a network, a truth that had been buried for far too long. And as they prepared to go public with their findings, they realized there was no turning back now. Their story had only just begun. The couple stood in silence, each of them grappling with the immense weight of what had just been uncovered. The message that had arrived in their inbox, the chilling realization that they had uncovered something far bigger than just a housing injustice, it was a stark reminder that they were no longer fighting for a house. They were fighting for their very lives. But now they were determined. No matter how deep this conspiracy ran, they would not back down. They knew the road ahead would be perilous. Every step would be watched, every decision scrutinized. The walls seemed to close in, but they had no other choice. The only way out was through. They began to plan their next move carefully. They couldn't just go public with what they had learned, not yet. The network they had uncovered was far-reaching, and revealing the truth could put them in even greater danger. But there had to be a way to expose what was happening. There had to be someone they could trust, someone who could help them unravel this web of corruption without becoming a target themselves. Late one night, as they pored over documents and pieced together the evidence they had gathered, a realization struck them. The missing piece of the puzzle had been in front of them all along, hidden within the very institutions they had thought were there to protect them. Their next step was clear: they had to take the fight straight to the heart of the system itself. They reached out to a trusted journalist who had covered housing and corruption in the past. This journalist, someone they knew had a reputation for digging deep and exposing truths, could be their ally. It wasn't going to be easy, and they knew the risks involved, but it was their best shot. The journalist responded quickly, agreeing to meet them in a safe location. They set the meeting for the following week, but in the meantime, they continued to gather evidence. Days passed, and the couple grew more anxious. The clock was ticking, and they knew they couldn't afford to wait much longer. With every passing day, the conspiracy seemed to grow more entrenched, more difficult to escape. Every move they made was carefully planned, yet every moment was filled with uncertainty. Was this the right path? Was this the right time? Then, just as they were preparing to meet with the journalist, another unexpected turn of events unfolded. The couple received a call from someone they hadn't expected to hear from again. It was from one of the people on the list, the same list that had haunted them from the very beginning. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "I know what you found. I know what you're planning. And I'm telling you, it's not too late to walk away. There are too many powerful people involved. If you go through with this, you won't just be fighting for your survival. You'll be fighting for your lives." For a moment, they hesitated. They were so close. But the fear in that voice, the warning that they were about to step into a battle far bigger than they had imagined, caused them to pause. Could they turn back now? Was there any way to undo the damage they had done by getting this close to the truth? But then, they remembered why they had started. They had started because they wanted to fight for what was right, to stand up against a system that was designed to silence voices like theirs. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had been affected by the corruption they were uncovering. They couldn't stop now. The day of the meeting with the journalists arrived. It was a quiet CAF on the edge of town, far enough from the watchful eyes of those who might be tracking their every move. As they sat across from the journalists, they could see the skepticism in their eyes. The journalist had heard countless stories before, many of them fabrications. But as they laid out the evidence, as they explained the breadth of the conspiracy, the look on the journalist's face shifted. The pieces fell into place. This wasn't just a story about housing. This was a story about a corrupt system, about a network of powerful individuals who had manipulated the system for their own gain. The journalists knew this was big. Bigger than anything they had ever reported on before. And for the first time in days, the couple felt a glimmer of hope. This could work. They could get this story out. The world needed to know what was happening. The journalists promised to help them, to investigate further and bring the story to light. But even then, they knew the danger wasn't over. This wasn't just a matter of reporting the truth, it was a matter of staying alive long enough to see the truth exposed. And they couldn't do it alone. They needed allies, people who would stand by them in this fight, no matter the cost. Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly with the journalists, poring over documents, cross-referencing names, and digging deeper into the web of corruption that had entangled them all. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how deeply the system had been infiltrated. It was everywhere. In every facet of life. From local government to real estate, from banking to law enforcement. They had barely scratched the surface. But as the investigation progressed, things began to take a turn for the worse. The couple began receiving threatening messages, anonymous letters, strange calls, and even unsettling visits from people they didn't recognize. They had been careful, but it was clear that the people behind the conspiracy were getting closer. And now, they had made it personal. One evening, as they were reviewing a final set of documents before meeting with the journalist again, the lights in their apartment flickered. The air felt heavy, the tension thick. Then, as if on cue, there was a knock on the door. A loud, insistent knock. They froze, heartbeats racing. They knew who it was. They knew what was coming. But when they opened the door, they found nothing. Only a package left on the doorstep. Inside was a single, ominous message: "It's over. You've lost." For a moment, they felt the weight of defeat. Was this it? Had they been too late? Had they played their cards too soon? But then, they looked at each other. They had come too far. They couldn't back down now. This wasn't just about their survival anymore, it was about the survival of truth, of justice. They couldn't let the darkness win. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. They took the final step, and with the journalist's help, the story broke wide open. The truth came out in ways they never thought possible. The network, the corruption, it was all exposed. The powerful people behind it, those who had controlled the system for so long, they could no longer hide. But the fight didn't end there. The couple knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, with dangers, with threats. The system they had fought against wasn't going to crumble overnight. But they had started something that couldn't be stopped. They had ignited a spark, one that would burn bright and lead to change. As the dust settled and the couple reflected on all they had been through, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced impossible odds, uncovered a web of lies, and stood their ground against a system that sought to crush them. In the end, it wasn't just about the home they had been denied. It was about reclaiming their power, their voice, and their place in a world that too often tried to silence them. The journey wasn't over, but they had already won. They had exposed the truth, and in doing so, they had changed everything. And as they moved forward, they knew they weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced. Everyone who had been denied a chance at justice. The truth had won.